My main research is on the domestic politics of nuclear strategy and nuclear policy. So originally I started work on the domestic politics of US nuclear strategy and how the collapse of the domestic political consensus in the United States after the Vietnam War led to the conclusion of the first major bilateral strategic arms control agreements between the United States and the Soviet Union. But what really interested me was not the sort of strategic side so much as the domestic political focus and the domestic political actors who were behind that. And so that was my main focus. And then I started working on Brazil because I started looking at US non-proliferation policy. And of course, the 1975 agreement between Brazil and West Germany really, caught the US's attention and was, a big focus for them and a big concern for them. What interested me and what struck me when I came here was when I discovered that there was a lot more on the domestic political side than I thought. So when I went to CPDOC in here, it was a real surprise when I opened the personal papers of Licinius Maciel, who was a federal deputy from Guanabara, and found that he had advanced a number of significant criticisms of the nuclear deal. That was a surprise to me because looking from the outside and reading the foreign literature on this topic, you really get the sense that there was total support and there was a very uncritical attitude from most politicians and the Brazilian public. So it was really interesting to me to find these papers and sort of work on them a bit more and try and dig down into exactly what was going on the domestic political side. Well, I think it's interesting because it puts the regime's policies in context. So it's important to realise that the domestic criticism of the agreement was not anti-nuclear. The criticism was that it was not assertive enough. Right, so Maciel was a nationalist, or seems to have been from what I can tell from the papers, and he really criticised, and a lot of people, including scientists, criticised on the agreement on these terms. And I would say there was really three aspects to the criticism. One was technological. There was this idea that a number of the techniques that Brazil was going to import from West Germany were not as effective as the government was saying that they were. For example, the jet nozzle enrichment method, which was a really important part, joint development with Brazil and West Germany. Second one is a political criticism. So there was a lot of criticism both from scientists and from the MDB opposition that really focused on the fact that having negotiated in secret, the regime had shut out the involvement of civil society and also scientific experts from participation in the agreement. So the shortcomings, the technical shortcomings, were really a product of this. And I would say the third element of criticism was more of sort of international and a developmental critique, which really focused on the claims that the regime was making about Brazil's independence and how energy independent it would make Brazil. And so they really pointed to a number of aspects of the agreement, for example, the supply of enriched uranium from Europe, and as well as the safeguards agreement that would have to be signed with the International Atomic Energy Agency, that really constrained Brazil's sovereignty. It was actually more of an infringement on Brazil's sovereignty. So there was this sort of idea, well, you're saying it's all about independence, but really underneath there are these other constraints which kind of qualify that in quite an important way. So I think it's important because it shows that there was a strong or sophisticated, not necessarily that well known, but sophisticated counter discourse to what the regime was saying. And it shows that in negotiating with international partners, for example, with the United States, the International Atomic Energy Agency, and West Germany and Europe in general, the regime was really, had in mind the domestic political check, which was not an anti-nuclear one, but was saying that there wasn't, the regime wasn't going far enough in protecting Brazil's sovereignty. So it's kind of a push towards being more assertive and the idea that they might be punished, at least in the closed, in certain circles, for not being so assertive in asserting Brazil's nuclear independence. Well, I think the Brazil case is fascinating. I think it really plays into the globalization of Cold War history. So originally, the Cold War was primarily seen, and post-1945 period was primarily seen through the prism of the US-Soviet competition, and that's where I started my research. But as I developed intellectually, I realized that there was all these other processes going on, including the assertion of new actors like Brazil into the international sphere, including on non-proliferation. And I think this sort of plays, looking at the nuclear side is interesting because I think it has benefits both for international history in the way I just described, but also for Brazil's domestic history as well, because I think it's important to show that even at this time in Brazil's domestic political history, when there was a lot of political repression, the regime was still criticized, and also these people took a lot of risk in criticizing the regime, a lot of personal risk. Maciel, for example, was threatened by the head of the Sao Paulo secret police, Sergio Fleury, for his stances on a number of issues. So it's important to recognize that. I think it's also important really to recognize that these debates have a continuing relevance because these people are talking about themes which sort of have transcendent value. They really, they're talking about things like what should be the balance between importing technology and developing it indigenously, what are the costs, what are the trade-offs. And the regime really tried to dampen down that debate and narrow that debate, which meant that it had a limited impact at the time, but it speaks really to these sort of transcendent themes in both the Brazilian history and also the history of developing countries, globally. So I think it's a great topic, and I'm really looking forward to working more on it.